Okay, great. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you to Android Worldwide for this opportunity to speak about testing. My name is Mohit Sarveiya. Nice to meet everyone virtually. Um, and I'm a GDE in Kotlin and Android, and I'll be talking about how to set up automation, how to set up automated testing, and build out your CI pipelines, your else to go into how to test different aspects of things such as snapshot testing, testing your Gradle for regressions. So when you think about the challenges of testing, suppose that you're working on a large project and you have multiple teams that are committing to it every day, and you have lots of changes going in, and you need to be able to test all of those changes of whether they cause any regressions. And manual testing doesn't really scale that well. You need a way that's automated, and you may be working on a large app where you have a lot of fragmentation. You have areas of code which are legacy and then new features. If you were to refactor an area which is legacy code, you want to make sure that it's under a test harness, it doesn't cause any regressions, and you'll have in a large code base varying degrees of code coverage in different areas. So when we think about testing, we want to cover testing for different types of technologies. It's not just the UI layer, it's also like testing database migrations. You also have to think about like testing if someone made a change to a Gradle build script, did it cause any regressions? And so there, it's not just about UI testing. When you think about Android testing, there is a lot of things that could cause regressions and in different areas of the stack in your Android app with like different technologies. And what I'll cover is how to test these different things, how to build out an infra that could cover testing out these different problems that could arise. So these are our goals. When you're building out an infrastructure for testing, you want to have these goals where it's automated. And that's number one. You want to replace manual testing as much as possible to get a lot of confidence in your changes that you're making. You want it to scale, and you want it to be really fast when you're running your test, and you want to be able to cover different types of problems that could come up. So let's start with UI test automation. How do you set that up? And what tools could you use? So suppose that you have a lot of end-to-end tests, UI tests, and you have for each of your features, you have a set of test suite built out test cases. And this test suite could be built out by Android engineers, it could be by software developers and test. And how do you go about running these different tests? So I want to run them on a physical device, and I want to go through each of my tests. So I could use a service like Firebase Test Lab. And what Firebase Test Lab is that it provides me with a device farm, a group of devices that are either virtual or physical that I could run my test on. And I can run my UI test on devices that have different API versions that have certain locales, for example. So how do you go about, uploading your APK to Firebase Test Lab and using Firebase Test Lab? There's a tool that's provided to you called gcloud. It's a command line tool. It's a tool that allows you to set up like what devices you want to run your test on. So, and it integrates well with your CI pipeline. And this is how it works. So, with Firebase Test Lab, with gcloud, you could query what are the all the devices that exist. So you can do gcloud Firebase test Android models list, and this will give you a set of devices that you could use. And you'll see that some of them are virtual, some of them are physical, and then you could see what are different OS versions that they support. So this really gives you, and there are also Samsung devices available. This really gives you a good array of devices from new to old that you could test things on. So the good thing is there are different types of tests that you can run. There are two types. There are instrumentation tests, which go through like all of your espresso tests, like one by one by one. They get executed. They're also suppose you're in a position where you don't even have an espresso test at all, and you could start off by using robo tests, which are types of tests that go into the app and they navigate to different screens and they give you a screenshot. But that's a really good starting point to start to get code coverage and try to replace manual testing. So with this command line tool, you give it the APK that it's going to upload. You tell it which device that you want to run your test on. So this is a Nexus 6, for example, with version 21. And what this will do when you execute that command, it will upload an APK to Google Cloud Storage. And then it will use that APK in Firebase Test Lab to run your test. So, and when the tests are finished running in Google Cloud Storage, you will see basically a way to be able to, you'll see a test report of all the tests that either failed or succeeded. So when you run basically your test with in Firebase Test Lab, and this is an example of what you would see. This is a test matrix. This is the result basically of the test that I ran, and it went through all of them. You have the ability to record a video. You have the ability to be able to look at a stack trace or why certain tests failed or not. So the other type of test that you can run, though that's an example of instrumentation tests. It went through all my espresso tests and it ran them. But you had no espresso tests at all, and you could run robo test. And when you run a robo test on your APK, and this is what it looks like, a result. And what it does is that it goes through basically your app, and it navigates to different, it crawls through different navigation points. So it will turn your app in landscape mode, or it will click certain buttons. And this really helps you to catch crashes in which like you may have like an exception, for example, when you open up a page or take a certain action. So this gives you a really good starting a good starting point to be able to get test coverage with using RoboTest. So the way you could set up your CI pipeline, either with Jenkins or with Circle CI, you could set up a pipeline in which you have different stages. First is you build your APK, and then you initialize gcloud, and then you give it the command that we saw. You give it the APK and tell it what type of test you want to run, and then it will run the test case, and it'll give you a result that you can wait for in your CI process, and you could store as an artifact or report. So then you'll be able to see as part of a PR like what the results were of the test. So one of the challenges with using this approach is that as you start to add more and more tests as time goes on, like more and more UI tests, end-to-end tests, you want to be able to execute them in parallel. You want speed. And with the approach that I showed you, all the tests were executed one by one by one. So how do you get parallelization for running your test? So suppose I want to run through all these test cases, and problem is it takes too long to run, and I want to be able to shard them or group them. So the other challenge with gcloud is that it's very difficult to configure. It's a command line tool, but what I really want is some form of a YAML file, for example, where I could specify my configuration for a test. And there's a tool that you could use that makes testing really easy. It's a tool that allows you to run Android and iOS tests in parallel, called Flank. So Flank doesn't use gcloud. It was recently rewritten. This is a project that was started by Walmart Labs, And Flank is a tool that's built using coroutines, and it handles uploading your APK and parallelizing them, sharding them. And it's a really great tool to get performance to run your tests in parallel. So the way you would do with Flank is that you specify in a YAML file that's stored in your repo, the locations of your APK, your test APK, and you could define an array of device models that you could run your test on. Suppose I want to group my test and I want to run it in groups of twos. So I have a couple of devices running a group of another test, and then I want both of these groups of tests to run in parallel. So how do I do that? So basically the way you could do that is that in Flank, you could specify that I want my max test shards, which is another way of saying how many groups that you want to run your test on in parallel, groups of two. It could be 2, 4, depending on how many tests that you have. And Flank is really smart, where it records, how long your tests are taking. It could group them using it's called Smart Flank. You could group them based on how long they're taking. Also, you could also configure that. So you could also specify the maximum time that a group should take to execute tests on, because tests could be flaky, for example. So this really allows you to run tests in parallel and gives you a lot of runs your test. Doesn't take a lot of time. So the way you run this is very similar to G-Cloud, where you do Flank Android test run, and you execute this as part of your step in your CI pipeline. So this will allow me to run tests in parallel. So what you could do then is that each of these groups of tests, as they're running, you could merge the test results and look at the report and save it as an artifact. So there are lots of reasons why a certain group, for example, tests that are being run could fail. And one of them is that you have flaky tests. You have tests that take too long. So flaky tests happen for a number of reasons. One reason why they could happen is that because you have concurrency problems, and because you have flaky third-party code, or you have some resource idling. And Flank provides you with features to be able to rerun flaky tests. And you could specify in the YAML file that I want to rerun tests at least twice, and that are flaky. This is one approach to handle flaky tests. Another way is that Gradle provides you with a plugin, retry plugin, that you could also use, in which you could provide similar configuration, how many attempts you want to do. So this is the pipeline that you would set up. You could build your APK similar to before. And how do you get Flank? You don't want to install it every time like your pipeline starts, your CI pipeline. You could create a Docker image that you're reusing, that you're pulling, that already has Flank installed. And Bitrise and CircleCI, they provide you with basically this support, and that you could reuse Flank with. And then you run your tests in Test Lab and gather your report. So another tool that you could use, if you don't want to use that approach, is that you could use a plugin called Fladle. And Fladle is a Gradle plugin that's kind of like a wrapper around Flank. It provides you with Gradle tasks that you could run, in which do the same thing. So, and it has also multi-module testing support. So there are certain recipes that are supported, and that Fladle gives you. Now, certain features that it gives you. Suppose that you have different types of tests, such as performance tests, regression tests, and you could run those types of tests in different groups, and like your regression tests, your In Gradle, you could specify configurations such as I want a certain group of tests to run on certain devices. So these are my performance tests. And then I want my regression tests to be run on certain devices. So this is a really nice feature that Fladle has. So with Fladle, what you could do is that you could set up your test pipeline where you're executing in one of the different steps, the Gradle command. So another problem that that you'll encounter is that when do you run these types of tests? Suppose you have this configuration set up, and one approach you could take is to create a nightly CI job that's basically using Flater or Flank, and that's running this nightly job to get regression to run a regression test, rather than running it as part of every PR. One of the challenges, even with parallelization, is when you have a lot of tests, it will take a significant amount of time. So that's why you could run it as a standalone job. Suppose you're doing a release and then you want to do regression tests, you could run this CI job. So what are the types of tests that you would want to run in your PR? So there's a certain types of tests called smoke tests, which are simple types of tests that basically go and navigate to different screens just to make sure that it doesn't cause any crashes. And this is something that's very, very useful. And in your test suite, you could have a collection of smoke tests that you separate out and that you'll run only in PRs. So these are types of tests that test basic functionality, and these are types of tests that you could distinguish, like in your test suite, by annotating them, like with this annotation, smoke test, for example. So a good example of this type of approach is in the Firefox app, which is open source, and it has a lot of this testing infrastructure built out. It's really nice, good example of it. And this is the link. It's called Phoenix, and it's open source, and it has a really good. This is a actual production app, and it's open source. It has good examples of a testing infrastructure built out, and in there, the way it's built out is that it basically when it runs your UI test, when it runs the smoke test, it uploads the result using in a platform called TestRails. And from my experience, I found TestRails is really, really useful. TestRails is a platform which provides you with documentation for your test suite. It provides you with you could view the results over time. You could create a standalone server. This is a free tool in which you have TestRails running, and you're uploading the test results, your automated test results to it. So here's an example, for example, with the Firefox, in which you could. This is what it looks like. All of the different. This is free. You could log in and view this, and these are the different types of tests that are grouped by like onboarding and home screen. There are also smoke tests in here, and when you click on one of these test cases, you'll see the steps that the test is taking, and you'll see over time in here basically the results of those automated tests. So this is really good for collaborating with QA engineers, building out this infrastructure. So TestRails is something that I found it to be very, very useful. And you could also track Flaky Tests in here. So that's a sample of a very simple example of a UI test infra that allows you to run UI tests, allows you to run tests in parallel. So let's look at now the testing infrastructure that you could put in place for unit testing. So when unit testing has its own set of problems on CI. Suppose that like a person is working on something and they have multiple commits in which they're making changes to certain different files. And the problem is that how do I figure out I only want to run the tests that were affected, not all the unit tests. Running all the unit tests would slow things down. So it's a really good performance impact if you could figure out how to run only tests that were affected. And I suppose in this pipeline, how do I figure that out? And there's a tool that you could use called Affected Module Detector by Dropbox. This is a Gradle plugin that leverages a certain piece of library from ASOP, and that allows you to detect which modules were affected as part of a commit. It could do a comparison of one commit to another. And it's very commonly used in the use case of running only affected unit tests. And suppose you had a multi-module structure like this, and you had an app and with different modules that depended on one another. In your root module, you could specify basically the base directory of your project, and you could specify that I want to compare basically from the previous commit. You could also compare from a fork commit or specify branch commit, and 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 then you could also exclude this in certain modules using this tool. So in your multi-module structure, then in your individual modules, you could configure which task do I want to run. So each module has different tasks. Like you could have different flavors. You may have test release debug, test internal debug, and that run different types of unit tests. You could configure which of these tasks that you want to run. It also supports Android debug tests also. So what this will do is that as part of your CI pipeline, you could, rather than running all of your unit tests, you could configure it to run affected unit tests in order to run only the tests that were affected. So this is something really useful. And also it goes the same for Android tests. And that cuts down on a lot of time in this stage of your CI pipeline. So when you think about unit testing, the good paradigm is that unit testing, they're faster and cheaper, and the more things you could pull down, like the more unit tests you could have is the better. And the more things you could pull down from these higher levels of integration tests, E2E tests at this bottom layer, and is much more, really much more valuable. And there are really nice tools that in the community that allow you to run things that were in the past really hard to run as part of unit tests, and most people will run them as integration tests. And these things are like snapshot testing and database migration testing. So there are tools that there's a tool that you could use that allow you to do snapshot testing with unit tests, and that's really a game changer. And this is a problem that happens a lot, where suppose you have a layout and you're making some changes. Suppose it's a constraint layout and you made changes to the constraint layout, and it caused unforeseen like UI bugs. Like you could cause things to be laid out differently than it was previously expected in certain cases. Like, for example, a smaller screen, for example, or a larger screen. So these are the type of problem that you could catch with snapshot testing. And Paparazzi is a tool, a library by Cash App that you could use, and it provides you with the Gradle plugin to generate a screenshot with unit tests. And it's a library that takes advantage of a library called Layout Lib. So when you look at Android and suppose you have an XML layout or you have a composed layout, and you could render it in the IDE, and the tool that's being used to render it, that's what it leverages. Paparazzi leverages to be able to render your layouts, your XML layouts, or your composed UI with unit tests. And the way you use Paparazzi is that you could have different types of configurations for different devices and themes and locales. And this is a Paparazzi object that I have set up. It's a test rule that you would add. And then you would basically run your test, and you could do paparazzi.snapshot. So this recently composed UI support was added, but you could also use this if you have XML layouts. So this is another thing that I want to bring up that I didn't have in this presentation. There's a tool called XML Starlet that you could use that basically does that checks your XML. You could have that as part of your CI step for any errors or problems in there. So this is a tool that generates snapshots as part of your unit tests. So the snapshots are generated and stored in Git. So you have to turn on a Git feature called large file LFS, large file system. And what it does is that you can run your paparazzi tests in this stage of your CI pipeline. And what the task that you can run is the ability to generate a report by running this Gradle command. And it will store basically a snapshot in your repo. And then it looks something like this, a snapshot, for example. And then you could run this task to verify against the previously recorded snapshot. So this is really, really nice. That really helps to fix, find UI problems or UI regressions much earlier. And the big part is that you can run them in unit testing. So it gives you reliability, basically. And so that's snapshot testing running on unit tests. The other type of problem that I've commonly run with is database migrations, and that was very difficult to test. How do you test database migrations in unit testing? So suppose that you have an app and you're like storing things in Room, for example, or storing in your SQLite database. Either you're using an ORM like a Room or SQLite. And how do you test migrations? Suppose an example that I have is that I have a user table which has a schema of 3 columns, for example, and I want to rename a specific column from user email to email. So how do I set up that migration and how do I test that? So this is a common problem that I've seen a lot that affects a lot of people. So you could set up migrations with Room, for example, easily now. It supports there's a feature called auto migrations, and it supports things such as deleting a table or renaming a column. So I'm renaming a column here on user email to email. And I could specify when I run this migration, my version will change from 1 to 2. So how do you go about testing this migration? So one approach, which is the approach in which you test this migration using an integration test. Well, so how do you set that up? So Room provides you with utilities to be able to test this migration with integration tests, where you could use this tool called Migration Test Helper. And you list out all the migrations that you want to test in the database you're testing it on. And when you run this test, this is an integration test where you need to create your database and manually insert values into your database. And you can't really run any DAOs at this point. And after you do that, then you could run this method called run migrations and validate. And it will give you then a database object back that you could use to query and just perform assertions. And the problem is that how do I basically move this code to be more of unit test? How do I do this in unit testing? So that's the problem. So there is a way you could use a GDBC SQLite driver, and that you could as part of Room. And there's a library that allows you to do this called DB Tools for Android. And it provides you with a lot of the scaffolding and tooling and makes migration testing really, really simple. And it could run multiple migrations or a single migration test. So how does it look? So this is the library that I found to be really, really useful. And the way you set this up is that there is a class that it provides called base migration test that handles a lot of the boilerplate code for you. And you give it basically what migrations I want to test on which database. And then you run the migration. So the method that it provides is called test migration. And then you could say, I want to go from version 1 to 2, and it will run those migrations, and it will basically change the schemas and run all the migrations. So the way this works underneath the hood is that this base migration test class, it sets up a Room database. And the most important thing to hear is that it's using a JDBC SQLite driver to be able to make this work. And it also provides this test migration method in which it's doing all the legwork, and it's using utilities to create the database and run the migrations and multiple migrations. And this tool has been it's really helpful to test your migrations and much more reliably. And so that's how you test database migration. So what we looked at is how do we, these are two things like snapshot testing and database migration, things you would do as part of your integration tests that have been really, really hard in Android to test. And now with these tools, it makes it much more easier. So what I shared so far is how to set up an infra to use these tools to test things were in the UI layer and with your databases, etc. But that's not the only place where where I have experienced problems where things could happen. You could also have problems with Gradle regressions. And although it seems tangential, you also have to think about how do you build out an infra to catch those problems earlier, for example, with Gradle. So with Gradle testing, you want to be able to detect build regressions earlier. So suppose you're in a scenario where you have multiple modules and someone either makes a change to a certain build script. Someone may have upgraded a certain Gradle plugin and it causes an out of memory exception. Like, how do you figure that out? Or maybe it causes a regression in the build time. How do you catch that earlier? So this is important if you're redoing how your app is structured in terms of the modules that it has. When you have, this is really important when you have a large app or when you have a project with multiple apps and they're sharing code together. So what you could use is a tool called Gradle Profiler that you could run on a nightly basis, or you could run it as a standalone CI job that runs a performance scenario, and it tells you basically the impact that a certain change may have. So you could run a number of iterations, 1, 2, 3, for example, and in each iteration, it performs an ABI change. And the ABI change could be like a change in certain class, a change in certain resource. So this allows you to really test incremental builds. And what you could specify is a performance scenario that's part of your repo, which says, I'm going to perform an ABI change in a certain file when I run these iteration, maybe add a method, for example, to the string utils file. And I could also run resource changes, add a new value like in the strings XML file, and I specify which task that I want to run. For example, the assemble task in this case. And then I specify how many iterations I want to do, and then how many warm-ups that I want to do. So, and then at the end, it gives you basically the mean, medium, in all the iterations, it gives you data that you could then analyze on whether it had an effect, negative effect, or a positive effect in a Gradle change that you made, for example. So this is the result HTML file, like it will produce and gives you the result of this graph. So how do we automate this in CI? So you could set up a standalone job, just for example, suppose someone is trying to introduce Anvil, for example, and you want to test how did that have a positive effect on your setup or negative effect? And you could create a standalone CI job either in Jenkins or CircleCI, in which the CI job is basically pulling a Docker image that has Gradle Profiler already installed. Locally, you have to install it using brew. So, and then you could tell it to run certain performance scenarios. You could create a CI job in which you provide custom performance scenarios based on the change that you're making. And then you could run this job nightly, for example. And this is really important to catch regressions, Gradle regressions earlier. So this is something that you could do as part of your Gradle test work. And so what I just shared were, how to test different aspects of your Android app, not just UI. This is a problem. This is a testing infrastructure I have in the past at many different places have set up, and set up the CI part also. And I hope that was helpful to you to learn about what technology and tools that you could use that are available for you. I want to say thank you to Android Worldwide for this opportunity to speak here once again, and thank you all for listening to my talk. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me on Twitter at Hey, it's Mohit. You can check out my website, Coding with Mohit, in which I have lots of content on coroutines, etc. on Android. And thank you so much.
Right, and thank you, Mohit, for that talk. All right, so we'll just wait a couple of minutes to see if any more questions roll in, and then we'll question and answers. I see we've got 2 questions already from Ryan and Shalom. I don't really like those guys, so we might skip them.
So the first question is by Ryan. So am I a bad developer if I don't achieve 100% test coverage in a GUI app? No, definitely not. So you want to test, good practices to test your business logic. And this goes back to the previous presentations that we had, which are about, architecture, MVI, and how to split apart your app, how to architect your app to be able to have your business logic in one place. So it's all about being able to. You don't have to have 100% test coverage. It's not feasible. So that, yeah, the most important thing is to test your business logic.
Awesome.
So the second question by Shalom. Shalom asked me to, do you compare Paparazzi with other screenshot testing frameworks? If yes, what are the cons of Paparazzi relative to them? So to be honest with you, I didn't use other testing frameworks, Snapshot frameworks, because of the stories I heard from others who attempted to use them. So I think that I don't know the cons relative to comparing to them, but it's been very useful, for me in my testing so far. I mean, it's the only framework that allows you to run snapshot tests and unit tests. So who are you going to compare it to? So yeah, the other question is by Anonymous. Can you show the last GitHub link? Yeah, so I will show, let me share my screen once again. I'll also share this presentation. So I will, let me share it. The last one was, I think it was on DB Tools. Where is it? Oh, right there. There it is. Oh, let me go back. Right there. That's it. Okay. So I'll also share that link in the chat. So the last question is, how do you encourage teams to write more tests? I think that, that's a good question. I think that it's part of it's a combination of culture. It's a combination of, combination of culture, common developers and managers working together. You want to find, the goal is to find problems earlier, not to get to 100% test coverage. So, the more it's part of our craft, right? To write, to produce something of quality, and to write unit tests, and it's not like a second afterthought. So to bring about this culture of testing, it's really a collaborative effort between managers, encouraging PE engineers to write unit tests, and also having senior engineers find encouraging in PRs that hey, I think this is a good this would be a good use case for writing business unit tests for a specific logic. And another thing is that, like, if you, for example, like some good data, if you see a lot of rollbacks happening, for example, for if certain things are failing that could have been caught with unit tests, then that's a good thing, good action items to have to not cause the problem again. to basically add something in a test harness. So it's yeah. So those are my thoughts. It's a combination of culture and encouragement, and that's my answer. No more questions.
All right. Looks like that is it. So thank you again, Mohit, for that talk.